When power protects its own. Chapter 1, The Island. The helicopter descended through layers of coastal fog, its rotors cutting the salt air into rhythmic pulses that echoed across the water. From his window seat, Daniel Reeves watched the island emerge below, first as a dark smudge against the gray Atlantic, then gradually resolving into manicured lawns, white gravel paths, and the sprawling silhouette of the estate itself. Even from this height, he could see figures moving on the tennis courts, tiny and purposeful as ants. Daniel pressed his forehead against the cool glass. 43 years old, partner at Whitmore and Associates for 6 years now, and he still felt like an imposter every time he received one of these invitations. The embossed card had arrived at his office 3 weeks ago, cream-colored stock with raised lettering. The Cormorant Society cordially invites you to the annual summer gathering. No address, just coordinates. No RSVP requested, your attendance was simply assumed. The pilot's voice crackled through his headset. We'll be touching down in 2 minutes, Mr. Reeves. Beautiful day for it. Daniel murmured agreement, though he couldn't tell if it was beautiful or not. The fog seemed to exist in its own dimension here, neither quite weather nor quite atmosphere, just a persistent grayness that softened all edges and muffled all sounds. Perfect for privacy, he supposed. Perfect for a place that didn't officially exist on any map. The helicopter settled onto the helipad with barely a shudder, the mark of an expensive machine and an expert pilot. Daniel removed his headset and waited while the rotors wound down, watching other helicopters queued up behind them. Through one window, he glimpsed Senator Patricia Vance stepping out onto the tarmac, her silver hair catching what little light filtered through the clouds. Through another, he recognized Marcus Chen, the tech billionaire whose face had been on 3 magazine covers last month alone. Welcome to Cormorant Island, sir. A young man in a navy polo shirt and khakis opened Daniel's door, offering a hand to help him down. His smile was professionally warm, his grip firm but not aggressive. I'm James. I'll be escorting you to the main house. The air hit Daniel immediately, colder than he'd expected for August, thick with brine and something else. Roses, maybe, or jasmine. The estate's gardens were famous among those who knew about them. As they walked, Daniel noticed security cameras mounted discreetly on poles disguised as lamp posts, and though he saw no guards, he felt their presence everywhere. The kind of security that cost millions didn't advertise itself. First time here, Mr. Reeves? James asked, leading him down a crushed shell path that curved between hedges trimmed into perfect geometric shapes. Yes. Though I've heard stories. James smiled. I'm sure you have. The reality is usually more modest than the rumors, sir. Daniel doubted that. The rumors were already extraordinary. Cormorant Island had been in the Ashcroft family for 4 generations, purchased in the 1920s when Malcolm Ashcroft Sr. made his fortune in shipping and steel. Over the decades, it had evolved from a private retreat into something more complex, a neutral ground where people of influence could meet away from cameras, reporters, and the inconvenient machinery of public accountability. Not a conspiracy, exactly. More like a consensus. A place where America's unofficial aristocracy could speak freely, make introductions, and occasionally coordinate on matters they all agreed were too important, or too delicate, for normal channels. The main house rose before them, a monument to old money trying not to look like new money. 3 stories of weathered shingle siding, expansive porches, tall windows that reflected the gray sky like dead eyes. Tasteful. Understated. Probably worth $40 million. Inside, the entry hall opened up into cathedral ceilings and exposed beams, with a massive stone fireplace at the far end where a fire crackled despite the August date. The air conditioning must have been running hard to compensate. Clusters of people stood talking in low voices, drinks already in hand though it was barely 2 in the afternoon. Daniel recognized more faces: Jessica Harmon, the federal judge, Robert Sinclair, CEO of Helix Pharmaceuticals, Diane Kemper, who'd been Deputy Secretary of State in 2 administrations. Mr. Reeves. A hand clapped his shoulder, and Daniel turned to find Thomas Whitmore himself, his firm's founding partner, a man whose Rolodex was rumored to contain every significant power broker in the Western Hemisphere. Thomas looked exactly as he always did, impeccably groomed, his suit somehow never wrinkling, his smile conveying both warmth and calculation. "Glad you could make it. Come, let me introduce you around. These gatherings are invaluable for building relationships." Daniel let himself be steered into the room, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, trying to remember names and faces while simultaneously trying to understand the invisible hierarchies at play. Who deferred to whom? Whose jokes received real laughter versus polite chuckles? Who stood at the room's center and who orbited at its edges? "Champagne, sir." A server appeared at his elbow with a tray. Daniel took a glass he didn't particularly want, grateful for something to do with his hands. "Daniel works in our public policy division," Thomas was saying to a woman Daniel didn't recognize, though her bearing suggested importance. "One of our rising stars. Sharp mind, discretion, good instincts." The woman assessed him with cool gray eyes. "Public policy. How wonderfully vague. What do you actually do, Mr. Reeves?" Daniel had answered this question 1,000 times, had perfected the art of saying nothing while appearing to say something. "I help organizations navigate complex regulatory environments. Often that means serving as a liaison between private interests and government entities, finding areas of mutual benefit." "A lobbyist," the woman said flatly. "A facilitator," Thomas corrected smoothly. Daniel helps ensure that well-informed perspectives are heard by policymakers who might otherwise lack crucial context. The woman's expression suggested she saw through the euphemism completely but chose not to press the point. "And you're here because..." "Thomas invited me," Daniel said simply. She smiled then, a quick flash that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course he did. Well, Mr. Reeves, welcome to Cormorant Island. I hope you find it educational." She drifted away into another conversation cluster, leaving Daniel feeling as though he'd been tested and received an incomplete grade. "Don't mind Catherine," Thomas said quietly. "She's protective of this place. Worried about dilution. But you belong here, Daniel. Trust me." Did he? Daniel wasn't certain. His path to this room had been conventional enough: good undergraduate program, Harvard Law, a brief stint at the SEC before the private sector's compensation and opportunities lured him away. He'd worked hard, made the right connections, learned to speak the language of power without flinching. But standing here among people whose families had been influential for generations, whose wealth was measured in dynasties rather than portfolios, he felt the gap between his world and theirs. The afternoon dissolved into a carefully choreographed sequence of events. A late lunch served on the eastern terrace, where Daniel found himself seated between a venture capitalist and a woman who'd made her fortune in defense contracting. Both were pleasant, intelligent, careful. They talked about neutral topics, travel, books, the challenges of finding good staff, while around them, other conversations hummed with subtext Daniel could only partially decode. Names were dropped like coordinates on a map. Projects were alluded to with meaningful glances. Once, someone mentioned the matter we discussed in Davos, and 3 people at different tables went silent simultaneously, then smoothly redirected their conversations. After lunch, groups dispersed for various activities. Thomas steered Daniel toward the library, a 2-story room lined with leather-bound volumes that Daniel suspected were more decorative than functional. About 15 people had gathered there, arranging themselves on furniture that probably cost more than Daniel's annual salary. "Now," Thomas said, once everyone was settled and the servers had withdrawn, closing the heavy doors behind them, "let's talk seriously." The atmosphere shifted. Backs straightened. The social pleasantries evaporated, replaced by something more businesslike, almost military in its precision. A man Daniel recognized as Lawrence Ashcroft, the current patriarch of the family that owned the island, stood near the fireplace. He was in his 70s but moved with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "Thank you all for coming," Lawrence began. His voice was soft but carried perfectly in the room's acoustics. "We have a situation that requires our attention. Some of you are already aware of the details. For those who aren't, here's what we know." Daniel listened as Lawrence outlined the problem. It involved Ellington Academy, a prestigious private boarding school in Connecticut. Founded in 1891, alma mater to 5 presidents and countless senators, Supreme Court justices, and titans of industry. For decades, it had also been the site of systematic abuse, teachers preying on students, administrators covering up complaints, powerful alumni ensuring that investigations never gained traction. 3 weeks ago, Lawrence continued, a former student named Rebecca Torres filed a civil lawsuit. She's now 34, successful attorney, highly credible. She claims she was abused by a teacher named Martin Grayson when she was 15. She has documentation, journal entries from the time, medical records, emails she sent to the school's headmaster that were never acted upon. Worse, she's found 6 other victims willing to testify. And she's threatening to go public in a very loud way if the case isn't settled to her satisfaction. Silence settled over the room like snow. Daniel felt his stomach tighten. He'd known these gatherings weren't purely social, had understood that problems were solved here. But somehow he'd imagined those problems would be abstract, regulatory issues, market challenges, political maneuvering. Not this. Not the deliberate burial of child abuse. "What's our exposure?" someone asked. Daniel recognized him, William Dresden, a hedge fund manager worth approximately $3 billion. "How many of us have connections to Ellington?" Lawrence consulted a tablet. 16 people in this room attended Ellington. Another dozen have children or grandchildren enrolled there currently. Several of you serve on its board of trustees. 5 major donors. The school's endowment is managed by 3 firms represented here today. And of course, Martin Grayson, the accused teacher, is the nephew of Senator Vance. Daniel's eyes flickered to Patricia Vance, who sat very still, her face carefully neutral. "The problem," Lawrence went on, "isn't just the lawsuit. It's what comes after. If Torres succeeds, if this becomes a public scandal, the investigation will expand. Other victims will come forward. The media will dig into every complaint the school ever received. They'll find patterns. They'll find more perpetrators. And they'll find those who enabled them, headmasters who ignored reports, board members who buried investigations, alumni who made donations contingent on silence. Many of those people are in this room." The words hung there, ugly and undeniable. Daniel looked around at faces he'd been socializing with an hour ago, seeing them differently now. Who here had known? Who had actively participated in the cover-up? And more disturbing, who thought this gathering was simply about managing fallout rather than ensuring justice? "So what's the proposal?" Jessica Harmon asked. The federal judge's voice was steady, professional. Daniel wondered if she was thinking like a jurist or like someone with her own exposure to protect. Lawrence nodded to someone Daniel hadn't noticed before, a woman in her 50s with short dark hair and the bearing of someone used to operating behind the scenes. "I'm Caroline Webb," she said, standing. "I run a specialized crisis management firm. I've been retained to handle the Torres situation. Here's what we're proposing." Daniel listened as Caroline outlined a strategy that was simultaneously brilliant and horrifying. They would settle with Rebecca Torres for a substantial sum, enough that declining it would seem unreasonable to any jury. The settlement would include ironclad non-disclosure agreements. Simultaneously, they would conduct an independent investigation of the school's historical policies, led by a retired judge whose impartiality was really just expensive neutrality. The investigation would find systemic failures, but no criminal misconduct. Several administrators would be quietly removed, given generous severance packages and recommendations for positions at other institutions. Martin Grayson would retire for health reasons, his pension intact. The school would implement new policies, hire a victim's advocate, make public statements about their commitment to student safety. And what about justice? The question came from Daniel's own mouth before he'd fully decided to speak. 20 heads turned toward him. I'm sorry, but what about the other victims? What about accountability for the people who let this happen for decades? Caroline regarded him with something between pity and irritation. Mr. Reeves, I understand your concern. But we have to be realistic about what outcomes are actually possible. A prolonged legal battle helps no one. The victims endure years of traumatic testimony. The school faces bankruptcy, putting hundreds of employees out of work and stranding current students. And at the end of it, maybe one or two people face consequences, but probably not. These cases are notoriously difficult to prosecute, especially when the abuse occurred years ago. Meanwhile, the damage to everyone involved is catastrophic. So instead, the people responsible walk away clean, Daniel said quietly. They walk away with their careers ended and their reputations damaged within the circles that matter to them, Caroline countered. That's not nothing. And the victims receive compensation. And the system improves going forward. Sometimes pragmatic solutions are better than idealistic ones that collapse under their own weight. Thomas placed a hand on Daniel's arm, a gentle warning. Daniel subsided, but his mind churned. Was Caroline right? Was quiet resolution genuinely better for everyone, including the victims? Or was this simply how power protected itself, dressing up self-preservation in the language of pragmatism and concern? The discussion continued for another hour, working through details, assigning tasks, ensuring everyone understood their roles. Daniel learned that Senator Vance would quietly speak with the Connecticut Attorney General's office, not to interfere with any investigation but simply to ensure that proper procedures were followed and that the situation didn't become a political football. Judge Harmon would make herself available for informal advice if legal questions arose. Several people committed to speaking with their contacts at major newspapers, not to suppress coverage but to provide context and background that might lead to more responsible reporting. It was all very carefully worded. No one explicitly said anything illegal. But the intent was crystal clear: ensure that Rebecca Torres's lawsuit was contained, controlled, and ultimately neutralized with as little damage as possible to the people in this room and the institutions they valued. As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Daniel felt Thomas's hand on his shoulder again. "Walk with me," the older man said. They stepped out onto one of the porches, where the fog had thickened into a gray wall just beyond the railing. Daniel could hear waves against rocks but couldn't see the water. "You're troubled," Thomas observed. "Aren't you?" "I've learned to separate what troubles me from what I can meaningfully change." Thomas lit a cigar, the smoke mixing with the fog. "Daniel, I know this feels wrong. It felt wrong to me too, the first time I encountered something like it. But consider the alternative. If we do nothing, if we let this play out publicly, what happens? A media-feeding frenzy that traumatizes the victims all over again. A school that's educated leaders for over a century gets destroyed. Hundreds of innocent people, teachers, staff, current students, suffer collateral damage. And in the end, maybe, one or two guilty parties see some consequence. Probably not even that. And this way, they definitely see no consequence." Thomas drew on his cigar, choosing his words carefully. "They see consequences we deem appropriate. Sometimes justice is messy. Sometimes it requires compromises. The question isn't whether our solution is perfect, it's whether it's better than the alternative." Daniel wanted to argue, but he couldn't quite formulate the counterargument. Was public destruction really better than private accountability? Did performative punishment actually serve victims more than quiet compensation? He didn't know. And his uncertainty felt like a kind of complicity. "You invited me here," Daniel said finally, "to see how things really work." "I invited you here," Thomas corrected, "because you're ready to understand how things work at this level. And because you're trustworthy. This conversation stays here, Daniel. Everything you heard today. That's the price of admission to rooms like this." Daniel nodded slowly. He understood. This was a test and an initiation simultaneously. By being here, by listening, by not walking out, he'd already crossed a line. Now he had to decide which side of that line he wanted to live on. They stood in silence for a while, smoking fog and moral ambiguity. Inside, laughter drifted through open windows, the party was resuming, the ugly business concluded, everyone free to enjoy their evening. Tomorrow they would return to their regular lives, their public faces, their official roles. And somewhere in Connecticut, Rebecca Torres would receive a phone call about a very generous settlement offer. Daniel wondered if she would take it. He wondered what he would do in her position. But mostly he wondered about himself, about the man who'd arrived on this island a few hours ago and the man who would leave it. Whether they were the same person. Whether he wanted them to be. Chapter 2, The Call. 3 days after returning from Cormorant Island, Daniel sat in his Georgetown office reviewing contracts when his assistant buzzed through. "Mr. Reeves, there's a Rebecca Torres on line 2. She says it's urgent." Daniel's hand froze over the keyboard. For a moment, he considered not taking it, referring her to someone else, claiming ignorance, maintaining the comfortable distance between what he knew and what he might have to act upon. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, made him press the button. "This is Daniel Reeves." "Mr. Reeves, my name is Rebecca Torres. I'm an attorney, and I'm currently engaged in litigation against Ellington Academy." Her voice was controlled but strained, like a wire pulled too tight. "I need to speak with you about Thomas Whitmore and certain activities that may compromise my case." Daniel's mouth went dry. "Ms. Torres, I'm not sure what you think I can help you with." "I know you were on Cormorant Island last weekend," she interrupted. "I know there was a meeting about my lawsuit. I know decisions were made about how to manage me." The words hit like a physical blow. Daniel's mind raced through possibilities. How could she know? Who had talked? Or was this a bluff, a fishing expedition? "Ms. Torres, I'm afraid I can't discuss." "They're going to offer me money," she continued, her voice hardening. "A lot of money, with strings attached. NDAs that would silence me forever. They're going to frame it as being in my best interest, in everyone's best interest. And maybe I'll even take it, because I'm tired and I'm broke from legal fees and I don't know if I can win. But I wanted you to know that I know. That someone knows what happened in that room." Daniel closed his eyes. "Why are you calling me specifically?" "Because you asked about justice." There was a long pause. "Someone who was there told me. Someone who thought you might still have a conscience." The line went dead. Daniel sat motionless, staring at the phone. Someone had leaked. Someone in that room had betrayed the confidence. And Rebecca Torres now knew exactly what she was up against, not just a school's legal team, but an entire apparatus of power working to contain her. His intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Whitmore is here to see you, sir. He says it's urgent." Daniel looked up to see Thomas already standing in his doorway, his expression grave. "We need to talk," Thomas said quietly, closing the door behind him. "We have a problem." Chapter 3, The Revelation. Thomas didn't sit. He stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the late afternoon traffic on M Street. Daniel waited, his heart hammering against his ribs, the phone call with Rebecca Torres still echoing in his ears. "Catherine Morse is dead," Thomas said finally. "They're calling it a suicide. Pills and alcohol. Her housekeeper found her this morning." Daniel's mind scrambled to place the name, then landed on it, the woman from the island, the one with gray eyes who'd questioned his presence. I'm sorry. Did you know her well?" 23 years. Thomas turned from the window. His face looked older than it had on the island, creased with something that might have been genuine grief or might have been fear. "Catherine was careful, Daniel. Methodical. She didn't make impulsive decisions. And she certainly didn't kill herself." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Daniel felt his throat constrict. What are you saying? I'm saying that Catherine called me 2 nights ago. She was upset about the Ellington situation. She thought we were handling it wrong, that the cover-up was worse than any scandal could be. She said she was going to talk to someone, a journalist, maybe the FBI. I tried to talk her down, told her to sleep on it, think it through. Thomas's voice cracked slightly. The next morning, she's dead. Daniel stood up, needing to move, to do something with the nervous energy flooding his system. Thomas, are you suggesting that someone from the island? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what I know. Thomas moved to Daniel's desk, placed both palms flat on its surface, leaned forward. And what I know is that powerful people don't like loose ends. What I know is that Catherine wasn't the only one troubled by what happened in that room. She was just the most vocal about it. Who else? That's what I'm trying to determine. But Daniel, there's something you need to understand about how these things work. When you're inside a circle of trust like Cormorant, there's an expectation of absolute discretion. Not because of some sinister conspiracy, but because the information shared in those rooms, if misused or misrepresented, could destroy lives, careers, institutions. People take that seriously. Very seriously. Daniel's mind flashed back to Rebecca Torres's phone call, to her words, someone who was there told me. Someone who thought you might still have a conscience, had that someone been Catherine Morse? Had she been the leak? And if so, what did that mean for whoever she'd told? Thomas, I need to tell you something. Daniel's voice sounded strange in his own ears, distant and hollow. Rebecca Torres called me this morning. Before you came. She knew about the meeting. She knew we'd discussed her case. Thomas went very still. What exactly did she say? Daniel recounted the conversation as precisely as he could remember it, watching Thomas's expression shift from surprise to calculation to something harder to read. When he finished, Thomas walked to the door, checked that it was fully closed, then returned to stand close enough that they could speak in near whispers. This changes everything, Thomas said. If Torres knows, if she can prove coordination between Ellington and outside parties to suppress her case, that's conspiracy. That's obstruction. That opens up criminal liability for everyone in that room. Then maybe we should have thought about that before we agreed to suppress her case, Daniel said, hearing the edge in his own voice. We didn't agree to suppress anything. We agreed to facilitate a settlement that serves everyone's interests. There's a difference. Is there? Daniel moved away, putting distance between them. Thomas, a woman is dead. Maybe because she had a crisis of conscience about what we did. And you're still talking about settlements and interests like we're negotiating a corporate merger. Keep your voice down. Thomas's tone sharpened. And think carefully about what you're implying. Catherine struggled with depression for years, her ex-husband could testify to that, her therapist, her medical records. What happened to her is tragic but not suspicious. And even if it were, even if someone did something terrible, connecting yourself to that by making wild accusations helps no one. It certainly doesn't help Catherine. It doesn't help the victims at Ellington. All it does is paint a target on your own back. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Daniel felt something shift inside him, a tectonic plate of certainty moving beneath the surface of his life. He'd always known, abstractly, that his work existed in moral gray zones. Lobbying, advocacy, influence, these were all euphemisms for using money and connections to shape outcomes. But he told himself it was legitimate, even necessary. That someone had to help navigate the complex machinery of power, and better it be someone smart and relatively principled than someone purely mercenary. Now he saw how easily those rationalizations dissolved. How quickly the gray zones darkened to black. What do you want from me? Daniel asked quietly. Thomas studied him for a long moment. I want you to be smart. I want you to remember that you have a career worth protecting, a life you've built. Rebecca Torres will be taken care of, not hurt, not threatened, just compensated appropriately for her suffering. The Ellington situation will be resolved quietly. And life will go on. But only if everyone keeps their heads and honors their commitments. And if I can't do that? The silence that followed felt infinite. Thomas finally smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Then you'll have made a choice about what kind of man you want to be. And choices have consequences. They always do. After Thomas left, Daniel sat alone in his office as twilight settled over the city. He pulled up news reports on his computer, searching for information about Catherine Morse's death. The articles were brief, respectful. Prominent philanthropist, board member of several cultural institutions, died at her home in McLean. No foul play suspected. Services private. But Daniel found something else too, a small item in a Connecticut newspaper from that morning. Rebecca Torres had withdrawn her lawsuit against Ellington Academy. No reason given, no statement from her attorney. Just a single sentence filing noting voluntary dismissal with prejudice. She'd taken the settlement. Of course she had. What choice did she have, really, against the weight of all that coordinated power? Daniel thought about calling her, though he didn't have her number and wasn't sure what he'd say. "I'm sorry. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't know." All of it felt inadequate, pathetic even. His phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. Just 3 words, "Check your email." Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he opened his laptop. The email was from an encrypted account, no name attached. The subject line read, "Catherine's Insurance." Inside were documents. Dozens of them. Meeting notes from Cormorant Island gatherings going back 15 years. Financial records showing payments from various individuals and corporations to crisis management firms, private investigators, media consultants. NDAs signed by dozens of people, victims, whistleblowers, journalists who'd agreed to kill stories. A spreadsheet labeled "Exposure Assessment" that listed names, potential scandals, and recommended containment strategies. And a video file. Daniel's cursor hovered over it for several seconds before he clicked. Catherine Morse appeared on screen, sitting in what looked like a home office. Her gray eyes stared directly into the camera. The timestamp showed it had been recorded 2 days before her death. "My name is Catherine Elizabeth Morse," she began, her voice steady and clear. "If you're watching this, I'm probably dead. And if I'm dead under suspicious circumstances, you need to know what I know about Cormorant Island and the people who gather there." Daniel watched the entire 17-minute video. Catherine laid out everything, not just Ellington, but case after case of powerful people protecting each other, burying scandals, ensuring accountability never quite reached the top. She named names, cited specific instances, provided documentation for every claim. It was devastating and meticulous and utterly damning. At the end, Catherine looked directly into the camera, and Daniel felt she was speaking specifically to him. "I know what you're thinking," she said. "You're thinking that exposing this will destroy innocent people along with the guilty. That the collateral damage will be immense. That maybe silence is kinder than truth. I thought all those things too. I told myself those lies for decades. But here's what I finally understood: systems that protect the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable don't reform themselves. They have to be broken. And yes, breaking them is ugly and painful and unfair to many people. But staying silent is worse. Staying silent makes you complicit. It makes you part of the machine." The video ended. Daniel sat in darkness. He hadn't noticed the office lights automatically shutting off, staring at the frozen image of Catherine's face. His phone rang. Thomas Whitmore's name appeared on the screen. Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he forwarded Catherine's email to 3 addresses: the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Then he gathered his coat, took a last look around his office, the diplomas on the wall, the expensive furniture, the view of the city where he'd thought he was building something meaningful, and walked out. He didn't know what would happen next. Didn't know if Catherine's evidence would be enough, if anyone would care, if justice was even possible at this altitude of power. But he knew he couldn't go back to the person he'd been 3 days ago, sitting in that library on Cormorant Island, listening to powerful people casually discuss burying the truth. Some things, once seen, couldn't be unseen. Some choices, once made, couldn't be unmade. Daniel stepped out into the cool evening air and started walking, with no destination in mind, just the need to move, to be in motion, to feel like he was going somewhere even if he had no idea where that somewhere might be. Behind him, his phone continued to ring. He didn't look back. Chapter 4, The Reckoning. The story broke on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Daniel had forwarded Catherine's files. He watched it unfold from a temporary apartment in Silver Spring, the kind of furnished rental where people stayed when their lives were in transition or collapse. His coffee had gone cold as he scrolled through headlines that multiplied by the hour. Cormorant papers exposed decades of elite protection schemes. Secret island meetings coordinated cover UPS, documents reveal. Senator Vance linked to boarding school abuse scandal. The Washington Post had done the heavy lifting, assigning a team of 8 reporters who'd spent weeks verifying Catherine's documentation. The story was airtight: names, dates, financial transfers, meeting minutes. They'd even found the helicopter manifests showing who'd visited the island and when. Daniel's phone had been ringing constantly since dawn. Reporters, former colleagues, even his mother calling from Oregon in tears, asking if what they were saying about him on the news was true. He'd turned it off after the first dozen calls, unable to face the questions he didn't know how to answer. Was he a whistleblower or a traitor? A man of conscience or an opportunist trying to save himself? He didn't know anymore. He suspected it might be possible to be all of those things simultaneously. A knock at the door made him flinch. He approached cautiously, checked the peephole. Rebecca Torres stood in the hallway, alone. Daniel hesitated, then opened the door. "How did you find me?" he asked. "I'm an attorney. Finding people is part of the job." She looked tired, dark circles under her eyes, but there was something else there too, a kind of fierce energy. "Can I come in?" Daniel stepped aside. Rebecca entered, glanced around the sparse apartment, then turned to face him. "I wanted to thank you. And to apologize." "Apologize for what?" "For doubting you. When I called you that day, I thought you were just another one of them. Another person who'd sold their soul for access and influence. But you weren't. You chose differently." Daniel sat heavily on the couch. "I'm not sure I chose anything. I just couldn't live with what I'd seen." "That's a choice." Rebecca remained standing, arms crossed. "You know they're coming for you, right? Thomas Whitmore's firm has already issued a statement saying you violated attorney-client privilege, stole confidential documents, fabricated evidence. They're filing criminal complaints. Ethics violations with the bar. They're going to destroy your career and possibly put you in prison." "I know." Daniel had read those statements too, watched Whitmore on morning television looking devastated and betrayed, talking about how he'd mentored Daniel like a son only to have that trust weaponized. The performance was masterful. "The FBI wants to talk to you. They've opened investigations into at least 7 people from those documents. Senator Vance resigned this morning. The Ellington headmaster is facing criminal charges. It's all coming apart." "Good," Daniel said, though he felt no triumph, only a bone-deep exhaustion. Rebecca sat down across from him, leaned forward with her elbows on her knees. "I need to tell you something. Catherine Morse contacted me 4 days before she died. She asked me not to take the settlement. Said she was going to make things right. I thought she was naive, that she didn't understand how power really works. I took the money anyway, $2.3 million, and all I had to do was never speak about what happened to me again." Her voice cracked slightly. I cashed that check, Mr. Reeves. I paid off my law school debt and my mother's mortgage. I bought silence with their money. And then Catherine died, and I realized what I'd done. What I'd let them make me complicit in. You were a victim, Daniel said. You don't owe anyone. I called the Post yesterday, Rebecca interrupted. Told them I wanted to void my NDA, testify publicly about what Martin Grayson did to me and 5 other girls. What the school knew and covered up. They're running my story tomorrow. Daniel looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the same thing he'd felt in himself these past weeks. The terrible freedom of having nothing left to protect except your ability to live with yourself. They'll come after you too, he said. Let them. Rebecca's jaw set. I've been silent for 19 years. I'm done being silent. The next hours blurred together. More calls, more reporters, more lawyers. The FBI agents who arrived at Daniel's apartment were professional, almost sympathetic, but clear about the severity of his situation. Yes, he'd exposed genuine wrongdoing. But he'd also potentially violated laws in how he'd obtained and distributed the information. They needed him to come downtown, make a formal statement, help them understand the provenance of every document. Daniel went willingly. What choice did he have? The interrogation room was exactly like in movies, gray walls, metal table, one-way mirror. 2 agents sat across from him, a man and woman in identical dark suits. They walked him through everything, his attendance at Cormorant Island, the meeting about Ellington, Catherine's video, his decision to leak the files. Did you know Catherine Morse was going to be killed? The female agent asked. No. I don't even know that she was killed. It was ruled a suicide. We're reopening that investigation, the male agent said. Her blood alcohol level was 0.27. Inconsistent with someone who rarely drank, according to people who knew her. And the pills found in her system, she had no prescription for them. Daniel felt cold spreading through his chest. You think someone murdered her? We think it's possible. We think several people at that meeting had motive to ensure her silence. The agent paused. We need you to testify, Mr. Reeves. Grand jury, and likely at trial. We're building cases against multiple individuals for conspiracy, obstruction of justice, possibly accessory to murder. Your testimony is crucial. And if I do that? What happens to me? The agents exchanged glances. That depends on a lot of factors. The DOJ is still deciding whether to charge you with anything. But cooperation would be looked upon favorably. Daniel almost laughed. Even now, even here, everything was negotiation. Everything was leverage and deals and favorable consideration. There was no pure justice, no clean right and wrong, just an infinite series of compromises and calculations. But maybe that was okay. Maybe justice didn't have to be pure to matter. I'll testify, Daniel said. I'll tell you everything I know. The female agent nodded, slid a legal pad across the table. Start from the beginning. Tell us about your relationship with Thomas Whitmore and how you came to be invited to Cormorant Island. Daniel picked up the pen and began to write. Outside, through the small window high on the wall, he could see a slice of sky, clouds moving past, indifferent and eternal. The world continuing regardless of what happened in this room. He wrote for hours, covering page after page with everything he remembered. Names, conversations, implications. The architecture of how power protected itself. The careful language that meant terrible things. The phone trees and coordinated messaging and quiet payments that made problems disappear. It all went on the record now. All of it exposed to light. Whether that light would actually reach the people who deserved it, Daniel didn't know. He suspected some would slip through, as they always did. The most powerful, the most connected, the ones whose exposure would threaten too many other powerful interests. But some wouldn't. Some would fall. And maybe that was enough. Maybe you couldn't dismantle the whole machine, but you could throw a wrench into its gears, slow it down, make it work a little less efficiently at crushing people who got in its way. When Daniel finally left the FBI building, night had fallen. Rebecca Torres was waiting outside, leaning against a car, her face illuminated by her phone screen. "How'd it go?" she asked. "I told them everything." She nodded, pocketed her phone. "Me too. Gave my full statement this afternoon. They're treating Ellington as a RICO case now, ongoing criminal enterprise. It's going to be ugly. It already is ugly." "Yeah." Rebecca looked up at the sky, at stars barely visible through the city's light pollution. "But at least it's honest ugly. Not hidden anymore." They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who'd chosen the harder path, or maybe just the only path they could live with. Daniel didn't know what came next, for himself, for the investigation, for any of this. But standing there in the cold March night, watching his breath mist in the air, he felt something he hadn't felt since before Cormorant Island. He felt clean. Chapter 5, Aftermath. 18 months later, Daniel stood at the edge of a small cemetery in Connecticut, watching workers install a memorial bench. The plaque read, "In memory of those whose voices were silenced. May truth always find its way to light." Rebecca Torres had commissioned it, funded by a portion of the settlement money she'd returned to Ellington's Victims Fund. She stood beside him now, hands in her coat pockets against the November chill. "They sentenced Grayson yesterday," she said quietly. 12 years. He'll be 73 when he gets out." Daniel nodded. He'd followed the trials obsessively at first, then with increasing distance as the months wore on. Martin Grayson convicted. 3 Ellington administrators indicted. Senator Vance's career destroyed, though she'd avoided criminal charges through a combination of excellent lawyers and carefully maintained deniability. Thomas Whitmore disbarred, his firm dissolved, though he too had escaped prosecution, the case against him built on implications and associations rather than direct evidence. Catherine Morse's death remained officially a suicide. The FBI had found suspicious elements but nothing conclusive enough to charge anyone. Daniel suspected the truth had died with her, or was locked in the minds of people who would never speak. "What about you?" Rebecca asked. "How are you doing?" "I'm teaching," Daniel said. It still felt strange to say. "Legal ethics at Georgetown. The irony isn't lost on me." He'd been cleared of criminal charges after months of uncertainty, his cooperation deemed sufficient to outweigh his methods. But his legal career was finished. No firm would touch him. He was radioactive, the man who betrayed the circle, violated the code, exposed the machinery. Some called him a hero. More called him a traitor. Most just wanted distance. "My students are idealistic," he continued. "They still believe the system can work. I don't have the heart to tell them otherwise." "Maybe it can," Rebecca said. "Sometimes. If enough people refuse to look away." They watched the workers finish installing the bench, test its stability, then pack up their tools. A simple memorial in a quiet corner of a cemetery. Most people would never see it. But it existed. That mattered. "Do you regret it?" Rebecca asked. "Everything you lost?" Daniel considered the question. He'd lost his career, his mentor, most of his friends, his comfortable life. He lived in a modest apartment, taught for a fraction of his former salary, and would probably never practice law again. His family had struggled to understand. His mother still cried when they talked about it. But he slept at night now. The dreams had stopped, those awful dreams where he sat in that Cormorant library while Catherine Morse's ghost stood by the fireplace, asking him why he'd stayed silent. "No," he said finally. "I don't regret it." Rebecca smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. "Good. Neither do I." She left shortly after, back to her practice in Boston. Daniel stayed longer, sitting on the memorial bench as afternoon light slanted through bare trees. He thought about power and protection, about systems designed to preserve themselves, about the price of challenging them. The trials had exposed corruption, ended careers, sent some people to prison. But the fundamental structure remained intact. There were still islands where powerful people met. Still rooms where decisions were made that would never appear in public records. Still mechanisms for ensuring that accountability stopped before it reached too high. You couldn't destroy those systems completely. They were too old, too embedded, too necessary to the people who benefited from them. But you could make them more fragile. Make the people who operated them more nervous. Make the cost of protection higher and the risk of exposure greater. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could do. Daniel's phone buzzed, a text from one of his students asking about an assignment. He smiled slightly, typed a response. His life now was smaller, quieter, less important by most measures. But it was honest. He could explain it to himself without flinching. As he stood to leave, Daniel noticed someone had left flowers near the memorial. Fresh roses, still beaded with morning dew. No card, no explanation. Just flowers for the nameless victims, the silenced voices, the ones who'd never gotten justice but at least now had acknowledgement. Daniel touched the cold stone of the bench, then walked toward his car. The cemetery was emptying as evening approached, long shadows stretching across headstones. He thought about Catherine Morse, about her courage in that final video, about the insurance policy she'd created knowing it might cost her everything. She'd understood something essential: some truths were worth dying for. And some silences were worse than death. Daniel drove home through gathering dusk, past monuments and government buildings, through a city built on power and maintained by it. Nothing had fundamentally changed. Everything had changed. Both things were true. At a stoplight, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The face looking back was older, more worn, but somehow more familiar than the ambitious young partner who'd boarded a helicopter to Cormorant Island what felt like a lifetime ago. That man had wanted to be inside the circle. This man was grateful to be outside it. The light changed. Daniel drove on, into whatever came next, carrying his small piece of truth like a candle against gathering dark, not bright enough to illuminate everything, but enough to see the next step forward. Behind him, the city's lights began to glow, beautiful and cold and indifferent. And somewhere in that vast machinery of power, other meetings were happening in other rooms, other decisions being made, other compromises negotiated. The machine continued. It always did. But now, at least, more people were watching. The end.